universal God of dependable and final attributes. And this preacher of a supernal God never ceased to proclaim this God of love. I dwell in the high and holy place, also with him who is of a contrite and humble spirit. And still further words of comfort did this great teacher speak to his contemporaries. And the Lord will guide you continually, and satisfy your soul. You shall be like a watered garden, and like a spring whose waters fail not. And if the enemy shall come in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will lift up a defense against him. And once again did the fear-destroying gospel of Melchizedek and the trust-breeding religion of Salem shine forth for the blessing of mankind. The far-seeing and courageous Isaiah effectively eclipsed the nationalistic Yahweh by his sublime portraiture of the majesty and universal omnipotence of the supreme Yahweh, God of love, ruler of the universe, and affectionate Father of all mankind. Ever since those eventful days, the highest God concept in the Occident has embraced universal justice, divine mercy, and eternal righteousness. In superb language and with matchless grace, this great teacher portrayed the all-powerful Creator as the all-loving Father. This prophet of the captivity preached to his people and to those of many nations as they listened by the river in Babylon, and this second Isaiah did much to counteract the many wrong and racially egoistic concepts of the mission of the promised Messiah. But in this effort he was not wholly successful. Had the priests not dedicated themselves to the work of building up a misconceived nationalism, the teachings of the two Isaiahs would have prepared the way for the recognition and reception of the promised Messiah. 8. Sacred and Profane History. The custom of looking upon the record of the experiences of the Hebrews as sacred history, and upon the transactions of the rest of the world as profane history, is responsible for much of the confusion existing in the human mind as to the interpretation of history. And this difficulty arises because there is no secular history of the Jews. After the priests of the Babylonian exile had prepared their new record of God's supposedly miraculous dealings with the Hebrews, the sacred history of Israel as portrayed in the Old Testament, they carefully and completely destroyed the existing records of Hebrew affairs, such books as The Doings of the Kings of Israel and The Doings of the Kings of Judah, together with several other more or less accurate records of Hebrew history. In order to understand how the devastating pressure and the inescapable coercion of secular history so terrorized the captive and alien-ruled Jews that they attempted the complete rewriting and recasting of their history, we should briefly survey the record of their perplexing national experience. It must be remembered that the Jews failed to evolve an adequate non-theologic philosophy of life. They struggled with their original and Egyptian concept of divine rewards for righteousness, coupled with dire punishments for sin. The drama of Job was something of a protest against this erroneous philosophy. The frank pessimism of Ecclesiastes was a worldly wise reaction to these over-optimistic beliefs in providence. But 500 years of the overlordship of alien rulers was too much for even the patient and long-suffering Jews. The prophets and priests began to cry, "How long, O Lord, how long?" As the honest Jew searched the Scriptures, his confusion became worse confounded. An olden seer promised that God would protect and deliver his chosen people. Amos had threatened that God would abandon Israel unless they re-established their standards of national righteousness. The scribe of Deuteronomy had portrayed the great choice as between the good and the evil, the blessing and the curse. Isaiah the first had preached a beneficent king-deliverer. Jeremiah had proclaimed an era of inner righteousness, the covenant written on the tablets of the heart. The second Isaiah talked about salvation by sacrifice and redemption. Ezekiel proclaimed deliverance through the service of devotion, and Ezra promised prosperity by adherence to the law. But in spite of all this, they lingered on in bondage, and deliverance was deferred. Then Daniel presented the drama of the impending crisis, the smiting of the great image, and the immediate establishment of the everlasting reign of righteousness, the Messianic kingdom. And all of this false hope led to such a degree of racial disappointment and frustration that the leaders of the Jews were so confused they failed to recognize and accept the mission and ministry of a divine Son of Paradise when he presently came to them in the likeness of mortal flesh, incarnated as the Son of Man. All modern religions have seriously blundered in the attempt to put a miraculous interpretation on certain epochs of human history. While it is true that God has many times thrust a Father's hand of providential intervention into the stream of human affairs, it is a mistake to regard theologic dogmas and religious superstition as a supernatural sedimentation appearing by miraculous action in this stream of human history. The fact that the Most Highs rule in the kingdoms of men does not convert secular history into so-called sacred history. New Testament authors and later Christian writers further complicated the distortion of Hebrew history by their well-meant attempts to transcendentalize the Jewish prophets. Thus has Hebrew history been disastrously exploited by both Jewish and Christian writers. Secular Hebrew history has been thoroughly dogmatized. It has been converted into a fiction of sacred history and has become inextricably bound up with the moral concepts and religious teachings of the so-called Christian nations. A brief recital of the high points in Hebrew history will illustrate how the facts of the record were so altered in Babylon by the Jewish priests as to turn the everyday, secular history of their people into a fictitious and sacred history. 9. Hebrew history. There never were 12 tribes of the Israelites. Only 3 or 4 tribes settled in Palestine. The Hebrew nation came into being as the result of the union of the so-called Israelites and the Canaanites. And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, and they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to the sons of the Canaanites. The Hebrews never drove the Canaanites out of Palestine, notwithstanding that the priest's record of these things unhesitatingly declared that they did. The Israelitish consciousness took origin in the hill country of Ephraim. The later Jewish consciousness originated in the southern clan of Judah. The Jews, Judahites, always sought to defame and blacken the record of the northern Israelites, Ephraimites. Pretentious Hebrew history begins with Saul's rallying the northern clans to withstand an attack by the Ammonites upon their fellow tribesmen, the Gileadites, east of the Jordan. With an army of a little more than 3,000, he defeated the enemy, and it was this exploit that led the hill tribes to make him king. When the exiled priests rewrote this story, they raised Saul's army to 330,000 and added Judah to the list of tribes participating in the battle. Immediately following the defeat of the Ammonites, Saul was made king by popular election by his troops. No priest or prophet participated in this affair. But the priests later on put it in the record that Saul was crowned king by the prophet Samuel in accordance with divine directions. This they did in order to establish a divine line of descent for David's Judahite kingship. The greatest of all distortions of Jewish history had to do with David. After Saul's victory over the Ammonites, which he ascribed to Yahweh, the Philistines became alarmed and began attacks on the northern clans. David and Saul never could agree. David, with 600 men, entered into a Philistine alliance and marched up the coast to Esdraelon. At Gath, the Philistines ordered David off the field. They feared he might go over to Saul. David retired, the Philistines attacked and defeated Saul. They could not have done this had David been loyal to Israel. David's army was a polyglot assortment of malcontents, being for the most part made up of social misfits and fugitives from justice. Saul's tragic defeat at Gilboa by the Philistines brought Yahweh to a low point among the gods in the eyes of the surrounding Canaanites. Ordinarily, Saul's defeat would have been ascribed to apostasy from Yahweh, but this time the Judahite editors attributed it to ritual errors. They required the tradition of Saul and Samuel as a background for the kingship of David. David, with his small army, made his headquarters at the non-Hebrew city of Hebron. Presently his compatriots proclaimed him king of the new kingdom of Judah. Judah was made up mostly of non-Hebrew elements, Kenites, Calebites, Jebusites, and other Canaanites. They were nomads, herders, and so were devoted to the Hebrew idea of land ownership. They held the ideologies of the desert clans. The difference between sacred and profane history is well illustrated by the two differing stories concerning making David king as they are found in the Old Testament.